The ground shakes, and the air fills with the smell of burning oil and cordite. A metallic screeching noise tears through the silence of the European countryside. For an Allied tank crew in 1944, this was the sound of inevitable death. The Tiger tank was not just a machine. It was a psychological weapon. It was a monster of steel that grew into a legend so terrifying that soldiers coined a term for their fear. They called it Tiger Panic. But today, we are going to open the steel hatch of history and look inside. Was the Panzerkampfwagen 6, known to the world as the Tiger, truly the invincible superweapon of the Third Reich? Or was it a logistical nightmare that lost the war before it even fired a shot? We are going to separate the Hollywood myths from the cold, hard reality of steel and engineering. The legend of the Tiger begins with its most terrifying asset, which was its firepower. The heart of this beast was the 88mm KWK-36 gun. This weapon did not start its life in a tank. It began as an anti-aircraft gun designed to shoot down bombers flying at high altitudes. When German engineers mounted this cannon inside a turret, they created a sniper rifle that weighed 57 tons. The stories you have heard about its accuracy are not propaganda. They are mathematically true. The optics on the Tiger allowed a skilled gunner to hit a moving target from 2,000 meters away, while American and British crews had to get dangerously close to even scratch the paint of a German heavy tank. The Tiger could destroy them before they even knew they were in a fight. In the deserts of North Africa and the open steppes of the Soviet Union, this range advantage made the Tiger feel like a god of war. There are combat reports from 1943, where a single Tiger battalion destroyed dozens of Soviet T-34 tanks in a single afternoon, without taking a single penetrating hit. This is where the myth of invincibility was born. The Allies watched their shells bounce off the front of the Tiger like pebbles thrown at a wall. It created a sense of hopelessness. Before we dive deeper into the armor that made this tank famous, I have a small request. If you want to see us destroy more historical myths with cold, hard facts, please hit the subscribe button right now. It helps us keep the engines running and brings more of this content directly to your screen. Now, let us look at the philosophy behind this machine. The Tiger was built with a specific doctrine in mind. It was a breakthrough tank. The Germans knew they could not outproduce the Allies. The United States and the Soviet Union were building thousands of tanks every month. Germany could not compete with those numbers, so their solution was quality over quantity. The idea was simple. If one Tiger is worth 10 Sherman tanks, then Germany does not need to build 10,000 tanks. They only need 1,000 Tigers. This sounds logical on paper. However, war is not fought on paper. The 88mm gun was lethal, but it was also heavy and slow to traverse. The turret rotation was powered by the engine. If the engine was running at low revolutions per minute, the turret turned agonizingly slowly. If the engine was off, the crew had to hand-crank the turret. To rotate the turret 360 degrees by hand, the gunner had to turn a wheel 720 times. Imagine doing that while your tank is on fire and the enemy is flanking you. The firepower of the Tiger created a dangerous overconfidence in the German high command. They believed that a big gun solved every tactical problem. They fell in love with the idea of the wonder weapon. But a gun is only as good as the platform it sits on. And this brings us to the first crack in the armor of the tiger myth. The tiger was introduced in 1942. By the standards of that year, it was an apex predator. But military technology moves at the speed of light during wartime. By 1944, the Allied forces were not helpless anymore. The tiger had stayed the same, but its enemies had evolved. We often hear the statistic that it took 5 Sherman tanks to destroy one tiger. This is a catchy number, but it is misleading. It implies that the tiger was 5 times better than a Sherman. The reality is that American tank platoons always operated in groups of 5. If they encountered a tiger, they engaged it as a group because that was their standard formation, not because they explicitly needed 5 tanks to do the job. Furthermore, the legendary 88mm shell had a flat trajectory, which made aiming easier, but the sheer size of the ammunition meant that the interior of the tank was cramped. The loader had to wrestle with heavy, long shells in a moving, vibrating metal box filled with smoke. The rate of fire was heavily dependent on the physical strength of one man. The Tiger was undoubtedly a masterpiece of firepower. It could punch through the armor of any Allied tank in service in 1943 from immense distances. But a tank is not just a gun. It is a vehicle that needs to move, survive, and adapt. And as we peel back the layers of steel, we begin to see that the Tiger was built for a type of war that Germany was no longer fighting. They built a gladiator for a duel, but they were fighting a marathon against a swarm. The second pillar of the Tiger myth is its armor. In movies and video games, the Tiger is often portrayed as an impenetrable bunker on tracks. You see shells bouncing off its hull harmlessly while the German commander laughs. The reality of the armor protection on the Tiger is a fascinating study in obsolescence. The Tiger I had 100 millimeters of frontal armor. In 1942, this was indeed thick enough to stop almost anything the Allies could throw at it. But thickness is not the only factor that matters in tank design. The geometry is just as important. The Tiger was essentially a moving box. Its armor plates were vertical. They stood straight up at a 90-degree angle. By the time the Tiger was dominating the battlefield, tank design had already moved on. The Soviet T-34 and the German Panther tank utilized sloped armor. When you angle an armor plate, you increase the effective thickness that a shell must penetrate. Moreover, sloped armor increases the chance that an incoming shell will deflect or ricochet. The Tiger ignored this innovation completely. It relied on brute force and heavy steel plates. This vertical design made the tank a massive, flat target that was very easy for Allied gunners to aim at. Because the armor was vertical, the Tiger had to carry much more weight to achieve the same level of protection as a lighter, sloped tank. This made the Tiger incredibly heavy, which we will discuss later, but it also meant that as Allied guns got stronger, the Tiger lost its advantage very quickly. We must also mention a distinct feature often seen in photos, which is the rough, ridged texture on the outside of the tank. This was called zimmerit. It was a paste applied to the armor to prevent magnetic mines from sticking to the hull. While it looked intimidating, it added days to the production time of every tank, solving a problem that rarely happened in actual combat. It was a waste of precious time for a threat that did not really exist. By 1944, the British had introduced the Sherman Firefly. This was a standard American Sherman tank fitted with a British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. The 17-pounder fired a specialized round called discarding sabot. This ammunition could slice through the frontal armor of a Tiger from a standard combat range. The British knew the Tiger was dangerous, so they prioritized killing it. German tank crews quickly learned that if they saw a group of Shermans, they had to destroy the one with the long barrel first. The Firefly proved that you did not need a heavy monster to kill a heavy monster. You just needed a better gun. There was also a fatal design flaw in the early turrets known as the shot trap. The gun mantelet, which is the armor protecting the base of the barrel, was curved. If an Allied shell hit the lower part of this curve, it would not penetrate the mantelet. Instead, it would ricochet downwards, punching directly through the thin roof of the driver's compartment. This design oversight meant that a shot that should have been harmless could instantly kill the driver and the radio operator. Later models tried to fix this, but it showed that the engineers had not thought of everything. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even worse for the Tiger. The Soviet Union introduced the IS-2 heavy tank and the Su-152 self-propelled gun. The Su-152 was nicknamed the Beast Slayer. It fired a massive 152mm high-explosive shell. This shell did not even need to penetrate the armor of the Tiger to disable it. The sheer force of the explosion could crack the welding of the hull, blow the turret off its ring, or turn the crew inside into jelly from the concussion wave. The invincibility of the Tiger was a myth that died the moment the Allies upgraded their guns. Let us talk about the famous durability of the Tiger in combat. There are legitimate reports of Tigers taking dozens of hits and surviving. This is true. But survivor's bias plays a huge role here. We hear the stories of the Tigers that came back with battle scars. We do not hear the stories of the Tigers that were flanked and burned out. The side armor of the Tiger was only 80mm thick, and the rear was even thinner. American tank crews were trained to use their speed. They knew they could not win a head-to-head duel, so they used smoke, terrain, and numbers to flank the German heavy tanks. Once a Sherman got to the side or rear of a Tiger, the German tank was just as vulnerable as any other vehicle. The Americans also used a terrifying tactic involving white phosphorus. The Tiger had excellent optics, but it also had ventilation fans to suck out the gun smoke. If an American tank fired a white phosphorus shell at the front of the Tiger, the burning chemical smoke would be sucked into the fighting compartment by the Tiger's own fans. This would blind the crew, choke them, and burn their lungs. Panic would set in, and the German crew would often bail out of a fully functional tank because they could not breathe. The myth of the Tiger also ignores the quality of the steel. Late in the war, Germany was running out of rare metals like molybdenum, which is essential for hardening steel. As the war dragged on, the quality of German armor plates deteriorated. The steel became brittle. There were cases where a non-penetrating hit from a high-explosive shell would cause the armor plate to crack or spall on the inside. Spalling is a terrifying phenomenon. It is when flakes of metal fly off the interior wall of the tank at the speed of a bullet. This meant a crew could be killed or injured by their own armor without the tank ever being technically penetrated from the outside. We must also address the turret rotation speed again in the context of close-quarters combat. In the narrow streets of a French village or the dense forests of the Ardennes, the Tiger was at a severe disadvantage. Its long barrel would get caught on buildings and trees. Its slow turret meant it could not react to threats appearing from unexpected angles. Furthermore, the hatches on the early Tigers were difficult to open quickly. Specifically, the commander's cupola on early models was very tall, making it an easy target for enemy gunners. If the cupola was hit, the commander would be decapitated or severely wounded. Later they lowered the profile, but the danger remained. If the tank caught fire, escaping was a slow and often fatal process. The driver and radio operator had hatches that could be blocked by the gun barrel if the turret was in the wrong position. Imagine trying to crawl over the transmission into the turret while the tank is filling with flames. The Tiger was designed for long-range engagements on open plains. When the Allies forced it into close-range brawls, the predator became the prey. Another critical vulnerability was the roof armor. The top of the Tiger was relatively thin, only 25 millimeters thick in some places. As Allied air superiority became total, fighter bombers like the Typhoon and the Thunderbolt utilized rockets to strike the tanks from above. The Tiger had no defense against this. The terrifying roar of an engine in the sky was more frightening to a Tiger crew than any tank on the ground. So, while the Tiger had formidable armor, it was far from invincible. It was a design from a previous era, trying to survive in a modern war. It relied on thickness rather than smart engineering. It was a wall of steel, but even the strongest wall can be breached if you have a big enough hammer, or if you simply walk around it. The Allies had both the hammers and the maneuverability. We have discussed the gun and the armor, but now we must discuss the true killer of the Tiger tank. It was not the British Firefly or the Soviet Beast Slayer. The true killer of the Tiger was its own engineering. This brings us to the most overlooked reality of the war, which is logistics and reliability. The Tiger was a mechanical nightmare that often defeated itself before the enemy even arrived. The tank weighed 57 tons. However, it was powered by a Maybach engine that was originally designed for a tank that weighed much less. This meant the engine was constantly under maximum stress. The power-to-weight ratio was terrible. To move this steel mountain, the driver had to push the engine to its limits, which caused frequent overheating and fires. In fact, many Tigers carried automatic fire extinguishers in the engine bay, specifically because engine fires were so common during normal driving. But the engine was not the weakest link. The weakest link was the transmission. The transmission and steering system of the Tiger were actually technological marvels. They used a complex double-radius steering system that was controlled by a steering wheel, just like a car. This was very different from other tanks that used levers. It made the Tiger easy to drive and allowed it to turn in place. However, this complexity was its downfall. The gears were delicate. The immense weight of the Tiger shredded its own gears. If a driver was not extremely careful, he could strip the transmission simply by trying to accelerate too quickly or climb a steep hill. It was a race car transmission trying to move a bulldozer. When a Tiger broke down, which happened constantly, it became a strategic disaster. You could not just tow a Tiger with a truck. It required 2 or even 3 heavy half-tracks coupled together to pull one dead Tiger. Sometimes another Tiger was used to tow the broken one. This created a dangerous domino effect. The strain of towing a 57-ton weight often caused the transmission of the rescue Tiger to fail as well. Suddenly, you had 2 broken heavy tanks instead of 1. To solve this, Germany had to build a specific recovery vehicle called the Panther. This was a tank chassis with a winch instead of a gun, designed solely to rescue other heavy tanks. The fact that they had to design and build a specific expensive vehicle just to drag their broken tanks off the field shows how unreliable the Tiger truly was. In a retreat scenario, if a Tiger had a mechanical failure, the crew had strict orders to destroy it with explosives and abandon it. More Tigers were lost to mechanical failure and lack of fuel than were ever destroyed by enemy fire. This is a staggering fact. The machine defeated itself. We must also consider the bridges. Most bridges in Europe in the 1940s were not designed to hold 57 tons. They would collapse instantly. This forced German engineers to design a complex snorkeling system that allowed the Tiger to drive underwater across riverbeds. While this sounds impressive, the system was prone to leaking and took a long time to set up. It was another example of over-engineering a solution to a problem they created themselves. Most of the time, crews did not even use it because it was too risky. Let us look at the wheels. German engineers used a complex system called overlapping road wheels. They looked like a stack of dinner plates. This design distributed the weight of the tank evenly, which gave the Tiger a very smooth ride and a stable gun platform. In the controlled environment of a testing ground, it was brilliant. In the mud and snow of the Eastern Front, it was a catastrophe. Mud and slush would get packed in between the overlapping wheels. At night, when the temperature dropped below freezing, this mud turned into solid ice. In the morning, the crew would wake up to find their tank completely immobilized. The wheels were frozen solid. They had to use blowtorches to melt the ice before they could move. Furthermore, changing a damaged wheel was a punishment. If an inner wheel was damaged by a mine or debris, the mechanics had to remove several outer wheels just to reach the broken one. This could take hours. In the heat of combat or a hurried retreat, nobody had hours to spare. Maintenance was a full-time job. The tracks required constant tensioning. After just a short march, the crew had to stop and tighten the tracks, a physically exhausting process. The Tiger required so much care that the crews were often too tired to fight effectively when they finally reached the battlefield. This complex engineering made the Tiger difficult to manufacture. It was expensive and time-consuming to build. Germany produced roughly 1,347 Tiger I tanks during the entire war. In comparison, the United States produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks, and the Soviet Union produced vastly more T-34s. The cost was astronomical. One Tiger cost as much as 3 Panzer IV tanks, or nearly 4 tank destroyers. The German philosophy of the wonder weapon failed to understand that in a total war, reliability and ease of production are superior to raw performance. A generic tank that works every day is infinitely better than a super tank that is broken half the time. We must also talk about the factories. By the later stages of the war, many German factories were staffed by forced labor and prisoners of war. These workers, quite understandably, had no desire to build a quality machine for their oppressors. Acts of sabotage were common. They would intentionally create weak welds, leave bolts loose, or put sand in the gearboxes. A Tiger rolling off the assembly line might already be broken before it even reached the front. The fuel consumption was another nail in the coffin. The tiger was incredibly thirsty. It consumed gallons of fuel just to start up and idle. On rough terrain, a tiger could consume hundreds of gallons just to travel 100 kilometers. As the Allied bombing campaigns destroyed German synthetic oil plants, fuel became liquid gold. There were entire tiger battalions that were abandoned simply because they ran out of gas. They sat on the roadside, fully armed and armored, completely useless because they could not move. The Germans even tried to use wood gas generators on training tanks to save petrol, showing how desperate the situation was. The logistics of transporting the tiger were also a headache. The tank was too wide for standard railway tunnels. To transport a tiger by train, the crew had to remove the wide combat tracks and install narrower transport tracks. They also had to remove the outer road wheels. This meant that every time a unit arrived at a new sector, they had to spend hours reassembling their tanks before they could fight. This reduced the strategic mobility of the heavy tank battalions significantly. They could not simply rush to a crisis point. They had to be shipped, unloaded, and rebuilt. When you look at the big picture, the Tiger was a tactical success but a strategic failure. It won individual duels. It terrified infantry. It created legends like Michael Wittmann. But it consumed resources that Germany could not afford. It required maintenance hours that the mechanics did not have. It demanded fuel that did not exist. The reality of the Tiger is that it was a fearsome opponent if you met it on its own terms. If you were 2 kilometers away on a flat field, the Tiger was the king. But war is messy. War is mud, broken bridges, lack of fuel, and close-quarters ambushes. In the real world, the unstoppable Tiger was a fragile giant. It was a masterpiece of over-engineering that collapsed under its own weight. The next time you see a tiger in a movie, remember the crew struggling to change a frozen wheel in the Russian winter. Remember the driver praying the transmission does not shatter. Remember the commander looking at the fuel gauge dropping to empty. That is the real story of the Tiger. Thank you for watching this deep dive into history. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to see more truth behind the legends, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. We have many more steel giants to analyze. See you in the next video.